Captain Daniel Hayes had fought on the front lines, survived the worst battles, and sacrificed more than most could imagine. But today, his fight wasn't on a battlefield. It was in first class, where a flight attendant's icy glare made it clear she didn't think he belonged. Doubt dripped from her voice as she questioned his seat, and the wealthy passengers nearby sneered, assuming he was some broke soldier looking for a free ride. But Daniel didn't argue. Instead, he handed her a small folded note, and when she finally read it, it shattered everything she thought she knew. What happened next changed her forever. Before we start, buckle up, get ready, and subscribe for a special surprise tomorrow. Captain Daniel Hayes stepped through the airport doors, the cool blast of air conditioning hitting his face as he adjusted the duffel bag on his shoulder. The terminal bustled with travelers rushing to their gates, dragging luggage and chattering into their phones. But Daniel moved with a quiet stillness. His uniform, crisp but worn, bore the insignia of a soldier who had seen more than his fair share of battle. The weight of countless deployments sat heavy on his shoulders, though no one around him noticed. To them, he was just another passenger. His fingers clenched around the first-class ticket in his hand, a rare luxury he hadn't expected. A businessman in the lounge had recognized his uniform, struck up a brief conversation, and without hesitation, handed over his seat. "You deserve it more than I do," the man had said, nodding with genuine respect, before disappearing into the crowd. Daniel had accepted it with a quiet nod, too exhausted to argue. Making his way toward the security checkpoint, he felt the usual eyes on him. Some looked at him with admiration, a silent acknowledgement of his service. Others glanced his way, uninterested, indifferent. It didn't bother him. He had long accepted that most people only thought of soldiers when they needed them. After a routine security check, he navigated the terminal with practiced ease. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the intercom crackled with flight announcements as he found his gate. Boarding had already begun, and a line of well-dressed passengers snaked toward the entrance. Daniel exhaled slowly. He wasn't used to this kind of comfort. For years, he had spent more time in military cargo planes and dusty barracks than anywhere remotely luxurious. Stepping forward, he handed his ticket to the gate agent, who barely glanced at it before motioning him through. As he walked down the jet bridge, the hum of the engines and the muffled conversations of passengers filled the air. Entering the cabin, he immediately felt the shift. The first-class section was worlds apart from the cramped economy seats he was used to. Plush leather, wide armrests, and a quiet, almost reverent atmosphere surrounded him. Daniel found his seat near the window and set his bag down. He was just beginning to relax when he caught the flicker of hesitation in the flight attendant's eyes. She was tall, blonde, and wore a neatly pressed uniform, her expression professional yet unreadable. But as she scanned the cabin, her gaze landed on him again, this time with something sharper, doubt. She stepped closer, her voice polite but clipped. "Excuse me, sir. Can I see your ticket?" Daniel glanced up, unsurprised. He had seen that look before, skepticism wrapped in forced politeness. Without a word, he handed her the slip of paper. She examined it, lips pressing into a thin line, before handing it back with a slight nod. But the hesitation in her posture didn't fade. "Thank you," she said, though her tone lacked sincerity. Daniel took the ticket and tucked it into his pocket. He had no energy for a fight. He simply turned toward the window, staring out at the tarmac, waiting for takeoff. The hum of conversation in first class was low, a quiet murmur of business executives exchanging pleasantries, a wealthy couple discussing their vacation plans, and the occasional clink of glasses as flight attendants served pre-flight drinks. Daniel sat still, staring out the window as the plane finished boarding. He knew how this went. He had been here before, not in first class, but in rooms, in restaurants, in places where people looked at him and made assumptions. The blonde flight attendant, her name tag reading Claire Benson, moved through the cabin, checking on passengers. Daniel could still feel the lingering weight of her doubt. She wasn't outright rude, but there was something in the way she looked at him, the slight pause in her voice, the way she had double-checked his ticket. He had no proof, but he could tell what she was thinking. As she passed by again, she offered drinks to the passengers around him. Champagne or orange juice, she asked the man in the seat beside him, a sharply dressed businessman who barely acknowledged her before requesting her posture champagne. Stiffened. Would you like anything? Her voice was professional, but there was an unmistakable coolness to it. Water's fine, he said. She nodded and moved on, but it wasn't just her. The businessman beside him turned slightly, glancing at Daniel's uniform as if just now realizing who he was. He gave a dry chuckle, swirling the champagne in his glass. Didn't know they were handing out first-class upgrades to the military. These days, he mused. Daniel didn't react. He had heard variations of that before. Sometimes it was said with admiration, but more often than not, it carried an edge, a belief that men like him didn't belong in places like this, or did. You save up all those deployment checks? The businessman continued with a smirk, clearly amused by his own joke. Daniel didn't flinch. He wasn't here to argue, and he wasn't here to prove himself to anyone. His silence made the businessman shift uncomfortably, as if he had expected a reaction. The plane doors sealed, and the safety announcements began. Claire and the rest of the flight attendants moved through their routines, but Daniel caught the occasional glance in his direction. As the plane taxied down the runway, Daniel let his eyes close for a moment. The weight of exhaustion settled. Over him, he was tired, more tired than he had been in a long time, and this moment, this seat, this brief chance at comfort, was something he hadn't expected. But even here, even now, he was reminded that peace was never given freely. The plane lifted into the sky, and as the world fell away beneath them, Daniel prepared himself for yet another battle, one fought not with weapons, but with quiet endurance. The plane had settled into its cruising altitude, and the flight attendants were moving through the aisles, preparing for meal service. The soft chime of seatbelt signs turning off was followed by the rustling of passengers adjusting their seats, pulling out laptops, and flipping through in-flight entertainment screens. Daniel remained still, his eyes fixed on the clouds outside. The window, the hum of the engines was familiar, soothing even. It reminded him of nights spent in military transports, the steady vibrations beneath him as he and his unit were flown into unknown territories. Claire moved down the aisle, handing out hot towels and taking orders. Daniel could feel her presence. Before she reached him, he wasn't sure if it was intuition or just the weight of her judgment still lingering between them. When she finally stopped at his seat, her smile was thin, forced. "Would you like the beef or the pasta?" she asked, her voice neutral but devoid of warmth. "Beef," Daniel said simply. She jotted it down and moved on without a word. No eye contact, no acknowledgement, just routine. Daniel wasn't surprised. He had seen it before. People who carried their biases in small, quiet ways, in the way they looked at you, in the way they spoke just a little differently than they did to others. As she served the other passengers, Daniel let his mind drift. He thought of the men he had lost, the ones who wouldn't be sitting in any seat, first class or otherwise. He thought about how many times he had fought for people who would never know his name, who would never think of him outside of a holiday or a patriotic speech. And yet, here he was, still expected to prove something. A soft chuckle pulled him out of his thoughts. The businessman next to him had been watching, clearly entertained. "You know, they really should have a separate section for military," he mused, spearing a piece of steak with his fork. "It's gotta be weird sitting up here with all these executives and politicians. Bet you're more used to—" "I don't." "No MREs in the desert?" Daniel didn't react. There was no anger, just the same steady patience he had learned to perfect. He let the words settle, let the man think whatever he wanted. Claire returned, refilling glasses of wine and offering more bread. When she reached Daniel, she hesitated just slightly before pouring his water, as if debating whether to say something. She didn't. Daniel glanced down at the tray in front of him. He wasn't hungry. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small notepad. He had carried it for years, scribbling thoughts, letters, messages to men who never got to read them. Without hesitation, he tore a small sheet from it, pulled out his pen, and began writing. His handwriting was neat, deliberate, When he finished, he folded the paper carefully, sliding it between his fingers. Then, as Claire passed by again, he held it out to her. "I hope this explains why I'm here," he said, his voice calm but firm. She blinked, startled for a moment before taking the note without a word. Daniel turned back toward the window, waiting. The war was over, but some battle without thinking, slipping it into the pocket of her apron as she moved down the aisle. She wasn't sure why she had taken it. Maybe she expected it to be a complaint, a passive-aggressive jab at her for questioning him earlier. Maybe it was something else entirely. Either way, she didn't bother reading it right away. She had a job to do, and she wasn't about to let one passenger disrupt her focus. The meal service continued, and Claire fell back into her routine, clearing trays, offering coffee, making sure everyone was comfortable. But the note sat in her pocket, an unfamiliar weight against her hip, nagging at the back of her mind. By the time she reached the galley, she had convinced herself it was nothing important, just another passenger with something to say, another interaction that would fade the moment the flight landed. She pulled it out, unfolded it, and glanced down, expecting some kind of complaint or demand. Instead, the words on the page made her stomach drop. "I serve so others don't have to. I lost 5 of my brothers last month so strangers could sleep safely in their beds. This is the first time in years I've felt something other than exhaustion. Thank you for reminding me that not all battles end on the battlefield." Claire's fingers tightened around the note as her heart pounded. For the first time since the flight started, she looked at Daniel not as a passenger, not as some guy in a uniform, but as a person. A soldier who had seen more than she could ever imagine, who had lost more than she could ever understand. She swallowed hard, her throat tight. She had misjudged him. Not just misjudged, she had dismissed him, assumed things about him without knowing anything at all. Her gaze drifted back toward the cabin. From where she stood, she could see the back of Daniel's head, his posture relaxed, but distant. His eyes still fixed out the window. He had been calm the entire time, even when she had doubted him. Even when the businessman next to him had been openly condescending. He had simply taken it, as if he were used to it. Claire exhaled. Sharply, a wave of guilt washing over her. She had been working flights for years, had dealt with all kinds of people, entitled executives, celebrities who barely acknowledged her existence, tourists who treated her like an inconvenience. And yet, here was a man who had given everything for people like her, and she had treated him like he didn't belong. Her fingers brushed over the note again. The weight of his words settled deep in her chest. For the first time in a long time, Claire felt something crack inside her, something raw, something real. She had to make this right. Claire stood in the galley, gripping the note in her hand as the hum of the planes surrounded her. She had read it twice, then a third time, each word pressing heavier on her chest. She thought back to the moment she first saw him, the moment she questioned his ticket, the slight hesitation in her voice, the doubt that had bled through despite her best efforts to sound neutral. She had made a judgment, a quiet one, but a judgment nonetheless. And now, those words in his careful, deliberate handwriting had turned that judgment into shame. She took a deep breath and looked toward the first-class cabin. Daniel sat exactly as he had before, staring out the window, his posture relaxed but distant. He didn't look like a man waiting for an apology. He didn't look like he expected anything at all. That made it worse. Claire turned back to the galley, pressing a hand to her forehead. She had been working flights long enough to know how people behaved, how they carried themselves, how they reacted when they were treated unfairly. Passengers who thought they had been wronged never hesitated to complain, to demand compensation, to escalate the smallest inconvenience into something personal. But Daniel, he had said nothing. He had simply handed her a note, not to guilt her, not to provoke her, but to explain. She felt sick. The businessman seated next to him caught her eye as she moved back into the cabin. He was laughing at something on his phone, still smug, still dripping with the same casual arrogance he had shown when he mocked Daniel earlier. Claire had served men like him for years, had perfected the art of polite indifference when dealing with their type. But now, in contrast to the quiet dignity of the soldier beside him, his presence felt heavier, louder, unbearably grating. Claire's grip tightened on the note as she exhaled through her nose. She had spent years keeping passengers happy, smoothing out issues, making sure things stayed professional. She had built walls, kept emotions out of her job, but this wasn't just a job. This squared her shoulders and walked back toward Daniel's seat. Her hands trembled slightly, and she swallowed against the knot in her throat. She wasn't sure what she was going to say, but she knew one thing. She had to say something. As she reached his row, she knelt beside his seat, lowering herself so she wasn't towering over him. He turned slightly, his expression unreadable. She took a slow breath, looked him in the eyes, and finally spoke. "Owe you an apology, Captain Hayes." Her voice was steady, but quiet, just loud enough for him to hear over the soft hum of the plane. "I judged you without knowing anything about you, and that was wrong." The cabin around them was silent. Passengers nearby turned their heads, sensing something unusual, but Claire didn't care. This wasn't about them. This was about making things right. Daniel turned away from the window, his sharp eyes meeting Claire's as she knelt beside his seat. There was no anger in his gaze, no trace of resentment, just quiet curiosity. He seemed surprised by her presence, as if he hadn't expected her to return, let alone apologize. Claire felt the weight of the moment settle between them. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to continue. "I shouldn't have questioned you," she admitted, keeping her voice low but firm. "I assumed things that I had no right to assume, and She hesitated, swallowing back the lump in her throat. "I just want you to know that I see my mistake now, and I'm sorry." Daniel studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, he nodded. "Thank you," he said simply. His voice was steady, controlled, but there was something behind it, something unspoken. Claire exhaled, a small weight lifting from her chest, but she knew an apology wasn't enough. She had spent years serving people, learning how to handle difficult passengers, how to de-escalate situations, how to keep things moving smoothly. But this wasn't about a smooth flight anymore. This was about respect. She reached into the pocket of her apron and carefully unfolded the note he had given her. For a second she hesitated, her fingers trembling slightly as she placed it on the armrest between them. "Your note," she said softly. She hesitated again, then shook her head. "It humbled me." Daniel's gaze flickered down to the paper, then back up to her face. He didn't say anything, but she saw the shift in his expression, a flicker of something that looked almost like understanding. A few passengers nearby were watching now. The businessman beside Daniel had gone quiet, his previous smugness replaced with an uneasy silence. Claire didn't care. Let them watch. She straightened slightly, bracing herself against the seat as she spoke again. "I serve people every day," she admitted, her voice softer now. "But I've never really thought about the people who serve us, people like you, and that's a failure on my part." Daniel's lips pressed together, but his eyes held something different now, something softer. He nodded once, slow and measured. "It's not about failure," he said. "It's about seeing people for who they are." Claire felt a sting behind her eyes, but refused to let the emotion spill over. Instead, she gave him a small nod of her own. "Well, I see you now," she said, "and I won't forget it." For the first time, the tension between them eased. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't overly sentimental, but it was real. A quiet understanding, a bridge built over a moment of misjudgment. Claire stood, adjusting her uniform. "If you need anything," she said, "I'll be here." Daniel gave her a knowing look, his voice steady. "I know." And with that, Claire walked away, feeling, perhaps for the first time in a long time, like she had truly done something that mattered. Claire returned to the galley, her hands still trembling slightly as she grabbed onto the counter for support. The weight of the moment clung to her, lingering in her chest like an ache. She'd spent years perfecting the art of moving on, handling difficult passengers, brushing off rude comments, keeping her emotions locked behind a polished smile. But this time, she couldn't shake it. Daniel Hayes wasn't like the entitled, travelers who demanded her attention, who expected the world to cater to them. He wasn't someone looking for sympathy or special treatment. He had simply endured. He had taken the judgment, the doubt, the dismissiveness, and said nothing. And that silence had spoken louder than anything. She unfolded the note again, smoothing it out on the counter, reading his words for what felt like the 100th time. I lost 5 of my brothers last month, so strangers could sleep safely in their beds. She swallowed hard. How many times had she looked past people like him? How many moments like turbulence, pulling her back into the moment? The intercom chimed, and the captain's voice crackled overhead, announcing that they were cruising smoothly and that service would continue as scheduled. Claire inhaled deeply, pressing her palms against the cool metal of the galley counter. "Everything okay?" a fellow flight attendant, Melissa, asked as she passed by. Claire hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, just thinking." Melissa gave her a questioning glance but didn't press. Claire wasn't sure she could explain it anyway. She glanced back toward first class, where Daniel still sat in quiet solitude. His posture hadn't changed. He was still staring out the window, lost in thought, still carrying the weight of whatever. Ghosts haunted him. The businessman beside him had gone oddly silent, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Maybe he had heard the apology. Maybe, just maybe, he was feeling a little ashamed. Good. Claire grabbed a small tray and filled a fresh glass with water, along with a cup of hot coffee. It was a small gesture, but it was something. She carried it back toward first class, moving with a new kind of purpose. When she reached Daniel's row, she carefully set the tray down on his table. "Figured you could use something warm," she said softly. Daniel glanced at the coffee, then up at her. There was a pause, a beat of silence where the past few minutes hung between them. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Thank you," he said, his voice calm, steady. Claire gave a small smile, nothing forced, nothing rehearsed. "No problem," she replied, before stepping away. As she walked back toward the galley, something in her chest felt lighter. The job was the same, the passengers were the same, but for the first time in years, Claire felt like she had actually made a difference. Claire moved back to the galley, but this time, the weight pressing on her chest had shifted. It wasn't guilt anymore. It was something else, something unfamiliar yet strangely freeing. She had spent years perfecting the art of detachment, making herself immune to the attitudes of passengers, the arrogance, the entitlement, the assumptions. But today, something had cracked through that armor. She stole another glance toward Daniel's seat. He hadn't touched the coffee yet, but his fingers rested on the edge of the cup, his gaze still trained out the window. The businessman beside him had stopped making his offhand remarks. Now he sat stiffly, staring straight ahead, pretending not to notice the tension he had helped create. Claire turned away, feeling the note in her apron pocket like a reminder burned into fabric. It wasn't just an apology she had given. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition of something bigger than her, bigger than this flight. She thought back to the moment she had doubted him, the moment she had looked at his uniform and hesitated. It wasn't outright hostility. She hadn't barked at him, hadn't been cruel, but she had let that moment linger, had let the doubt be felt, and that had been enough. Enough for him to see it, enough for him to feel it. The thought made her stomach turn. A few minutes later, she walked back through the cabin, doing her routine check. As she passed Daniel's row, she noticed the coffee was gone, the cup empty and neatly placed back on the tray. He had accepted the gesture. Then, to her surprise, he turned slightly, just enough to look at her as she walked past. "Miss Benson," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She stopped, blinking in surprise. "Yes?" He held out something small, resting in the palm of his hand. Her breath hitched when she saw what it was, his purple heart. Claire's heart pounded. She stared at it, then back at him, confusion and disbelief battling inside her. It's not for you to keep," Daniel said gently, reading her hesitation. "But I wanted you to hold it, just for a second." Her hands trembled as she reached out, carefully taking the metal. The metal was cool against her fingers, heavier than she expected. She had never held something like this before, never touched something that carried so much weight. So much sacrifice. She swallowed, hard, feeling the sting of tears she refused to let fall. After a moment, she carefully placed it back in his hand. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel nodded, a small, knowing smile flickering across his face. "Now you see." Claire exhaled, stepping back, her pulse still racing. She did see, and she would never forget. Claire stood there for a moment longer than she should have, her hands still tingling from where they had held Daniel's medal. The weight of it lingered, not just in her fingers, but deep in her chest. She had never been handed something so personal, so meaningful, from a complete stranger before. It wasn't a trinket or a gesture of pity. It was a lesson, a truth she had been unable to find the right words. Before stepping away, her mind spinning. As she moved back down the aisle, she noticed something else, a shift, subtle but undeniable. Other passengers had seen what happened. They had seen her kneel beside his seat, had seen the quiet exchange of words, had seen her take the medal into her hands. And now they were looking at him differently. The businessman who had mocked him earlier sat stiffly, pretending to focus on his phone, though his eyes flicked toward Daniel every so often. The elderly woman across the aisle, who had remained silent through most of the flight, now watched him with a quiet reverence. Even the younger man in the row ahead, who had barely looked up from his tablet, now seemed uneasy, as if realizing he had been indifferent when he shouldn't have been. Claire didn't know what to make of it, but she knew this. People were seeing him now. Not just the uniform, not just the assumption of who he was or why he was here, but him. And for the first time, she wondered how often he went unnoticed, how many times he had walked into rooms full of people who never looked past the surface. She reached the galley and took a steadying breath. The other flight attendants were busy with their own tasks, but Melissa glanced over at her, eyebrows raised. "You okay?" Claire hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just thinking." Melissa smirked. "You? Thinking about a passenger? That's a first." Claire let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. It was true. She never let herself get too involved, never let any one interaction get under her skin. But this time, she had to. This wasn't about customer service or professionalism. This was about respect. She stole one last glance toward first class. Daniel had turned back toward the window, but something had changed in his posture. He looked lighter, more at ease. Claire didn't expect a grand moment, didn't expect applause or some dramatic revelation, but as she looked around, as she saw the small shifts in how the other passengers held themselves, she realized that this moment, small as it was, mattered for Daniel. For her, for the people who had judged him too quickly, and as she tightened her apron and prepared to finish the flight, she knew one thing for certain. She would never make that mistake again. As the flight continued, the tension that had once filled the first-class cabin began to fade, replaced by something else, something quieter, more reflective. Claire moved through the aisles, checking on passengers, but her mind remained on the exchange she had just had with Daniel. She had been in this job for years, had served thousands of people, but no single moment had ever made her feel the way this one did. When she passed by Daniel's row again, she noticed the businessman beside him had stopped scrolling through his phone. Instead, he sat with his fingers laced together, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular, as if deep in thought. For the first time since boarding, he wasn't trying to make conversation, wasn't throwing out careless remarks about who belonged in first class and who didn't. Claire lingered near the front of the cabin, watching the small, subtle changes. The elderly woman a few rows ahead, the one who had remained silent for most of the flight, finally turned in her seat. She looked at Daniel, her expression soft, almost regretful. "Thank you for your service," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel glanced over, his face neutral at first, but then he nodded. "You're welcome, ma'am." It was a simple exchange, one Claire had heard passengers say before, but this time it felt different. This wasn't a rehearsed phrase, not something said out of obligation. The woman had seen what had happened. She had witnessed Claire's mistake, had likely felt her own guilt at not speaking up sooner. And now she was trying to make it right in the only way she knew how. Daniel didn't seem like a man who needed recognition, but the moment wasn't lost on him either. His posture shifted slightly, his shoulders easing just a little, the exhaustion in his face less pronounced. One by one, others began to notice. The young man across the aisle, the one who had barely looked up from his tablet, now glanced at Daniel with something like respect. Even the businessman, the one who had mocked him earlier, seemed uneasy, shifting in his seat, as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how. Claire wasn't sure what she had expected after her apology, but she hadn't expected this. A ripple effect spreading across the cabin, changing the way people saw him. She didn't need grand gestures or dramatic realizations. This was enough. When she passed Daniel one last time, their eyes met briefly. He didn't say anything, didn't need to, but there was something in his gaze that hadn't been there before. Not forgiveness, not expectation, just down the aisle, tending to the rest of the passengers. She knew that this flight, the one she had thought would be just like any other, would stay with her for a long, long time. The flight continued in a way that felt different, though no one said anything outright. The atmosphere in first class had shifted, not in a dramatic way, but in the subtle, quiet moments that made all the difference. Claire had seen it happen in real time, the slow unraveling of assumptions, the way people began to realize that they had been looking at Daniel without really seeing him. She noticed the businessman glancing toward Daniel every so often, clearly uncomfortable. It wasn't the kind of discomfort that came from irritation, but rather from awareness, the kind that settled in when someone realized they had been wrong but didn't quite know how to fix it. Claire wasn't sure if he would say anything, and honestly, she didn't expect him to. Some people couldn't bring themselves to admit when they had misjudged someone, especially when it was done so carelessly. But then, just as she was passing by, she heard him clear his throat. "Hey," the businessman muttered, shifting in his seat. Daniel turned slightly, waiting. He didn't prompt him, didn't push for anything, just let the moment hang between them. The businessman exhaled through his nose, drumming his fingers against the armrest. He hesitated, then shook his head. "I was out of line earlier." Daniel didn't react immediately. He simply studied him, as if assessing whether or not the words were genuine. Then, after a long pause, he nodded once. "Yeah," he said, not unkindly. "You were." The businessman huffed out a quiet, self-deprecating chuckle and gave a small nod. "Fair enough." Claire lingered a moment longer than she should have, watching the exchange. She wasn't sure if she had ever seen something like this before. A man like Daniel, one who carried his burdens in silence, and a man like the businessman, who was clearly used to being the most important person in the room, finally seeing each other on equal ground. The tension that had once filled the space between them had thinned, replaced by something else. Maybe not friendship, but at least mutual understanding. Claire exhaled, moving back toward the galley. She didn't expect everyone on this flight to suddenly change overnight. People didn't work that way. But maybe, just maybe, this was a reminder they would carry with them. She reached into her pocket and felt the folded note still tucked away. She would keep it. Not because she needed to be reminded of her mistake, but because she never wanted to forget this moment. As she turned back toward the cabin, she caught Daniel watching her. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes said enough. They understood each other now, and somehow that was enough. The plane began its descent, the soft chime of the seatbelt sign signaling the final stretch of the journey. Passengers stirred, stretching their legs, tucking away tablets and laptops. The hush of quiet conversation filled the cabin, but something about it felt different now, less dismissive, less detached. Claire moved through the aisle one last time, checking that seatbacks were upright, trays secured, and passengers ready for landing. She had done this 1,000 times before, but today she felt more present, more aware of the people around her, not just as customers, but as individuals with lives and stories she would never fully know. When she reached Daniel's row, she slowed, her fingers brushing over the edge of his armrest as she steadied herself against the small jolt of turbulence. He turned his head slightly, looking at her. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then she inhaled softly and said, "Safe travels, Captain." Daniel gave her a small, knowing nod. "You too, Miss Benson." And that was it. No grand moment, no drawn-out exchange, just mutual understanding, the kind that didn't need to be spoken to be felt. As the plane touched down, the tires screeching against the runway, Claire braced herself for the usual rush of passengers eager to deboard. She had come to expect the impatience, the urgency of people pushing forward, desperate to be the first ones out. But today, something was different. No one rushed to stand the moment the seatbelt sign switched off. No one elbowed their way into the aisle. Instead, there was a moment of hesitation, a collective pause, as if the people around her had felt the shift too. Daniel took his time gathering his bag, moving with the same quiet composure he had carried. Throughout the flight, as he stepped into the aisle, the elderly woman across from him reached out and touched his sleeve gently. "Thank you again," she murmured, her voice sincere. Daniel simply nodded, tipping his head in a way that was both respectful and humble. And then, just as he turned toward the exit, something unexpected happened. Who had spent the first half of the flight so sure of his place above others, stood aside, stepping back to let Daniel go first. It wasn't much. It wasn't some grand speech or apology, but it was something. A silent acknowledgement, a small but meaningful gesture of respect. Daniel didn't gloat, didn't react beyond a simple nod. He just walked forward, disappearing down the jet bridge, leaving behind a plane full of people who would never look at a soldier the same way again. Claire remained by the door as passengers exited, her fingers still curled around the folded note in her pocket. She wasn't sure why, but she knew she would keep it. A reminder, a lesson. As the last passengers left, she exhaled slowly, adjusting her uniform. This flight, she knew, had changed her, and she would never forget it.